Next, we have Ruth, talking about everything.
Yes, as I've talked to several of you about, my role here is more than many of yours to talk about everything. And so I'm hoping that I can get you sort of a mix of TED as the person and TED in research kind of contest. Okay, so back in 1993, I went to ARVO for the first time. You guys have heard about that from a few of the other speakers. I was a grad student with Jitendra Malik, shown there, with Pietro Perona. They're standing in front of the cool house that we rented out on Longboat Key. And Ted and I met at that conference, and we got to know each other a bit during a really excellent game of charades. And for those of you who haven't heard the stories yet, I'm sure any of us that participated would be happy to share stories about this wonderful game of charades. Ted was a professor at the MIT Media Lab at the time. He was working in both human vision and computer vision. I was predominantly working in computer vision. I had a long-term interest in both human vision and computer vision, but I was doing computer vision at the time basically because I really loved image processing. Oh, and I should say, so there's us and them in front of the house. Here is Ted with Jitendra, and Jeff Lubin is in the middle there, and he'll come up later again. And I was actually inspired in a science sense from Ted right from the start. And not so much the work that he was doing per se, because I was working on very different problems, but more the way of doing science. And one way of looking at this is, Jitendra told me much later that he, to some extent, thought of computer vision as applied math. And I certainly liked math. Ted would probably be literally the first person to tell you that I like math quite a bit more than he does. But like, for instance, we had this postdoc in the group, Tuan Long, who was a Faugeras student. And for those of you from old school computer vision, you probably know that Faugeras really likes math. And I was starting to realize I perhaps did not like math quite that much. And my thesis involved quite a bit with this book. I was learning differential geometry from a Shams outline series, and literally the only time I've ever learned anything that way. And I was doing that so I could do shape from texture. So a lot of math involved to try and find out the shape and curvature of a point on a surface by looking at the way that the texture varies. And this was great. And by the way, if you don't know differential geometry, I strongly recommend learning it from Shams outline series. I got a lot of intuitions from that I've used in a lot of other parts of vision. But I was becoming unsure that was what I wanted the rest of my vision career to look like, was learning yet more stuff from more Shams outline series so that I could do lots of math. And Ted, as many people have talked about, has this very attractive way of doing science where he spends an awful lot of time just looking at stuff and thinking deep thoughts. And often with the help of Canvas or Photoshop or whatever the tool was at the time. You play with a lot of different versions of this illusion, and by figuring out what works well and what doesn't work so well, you learn about vision. Or you wave your hand in front of a background and you think hard about what might be going on in understanding motion. And so I was interested in doing this sort of, maybe a little more of this kind of thing in my own doing of vision. And the other thing that I was really sort of envious that he was so good at was thinking really big picture thoughts and really thinking about like what was best for the advancement of science. And I probably spent like maybe the next 10 years trying to figure out like how do you think those big thoughts about science. But this kind of looking and thinking thing seemed a bit more in reach. So I decided to kind of try and head in that direction. And in my hands, this took more the form of, is this problem that I'm interested in easy if I just think about it in sort of like the right representation in the right space? And you might think of this as being kind of akin to the stuff about plaids that Tony talked about earlier. This is kind of looking at things in the right space and making sense of them. Or also the spatiotemporal orientation as a way of thinking about motion, that kind of thing. And so some of the stuff that I did that was kind of along these lines is how do you extract, by looking at this image, the three perceptual groups that a human will tend to see. The white circles is one group, and the gray circles is another, and the black background is another. And in pixel space, it's not a horribly hard problem, but it's a little tricky to figure out how to do this. But it becomes quite easy if you just think of it in an extra dimension, in X, Y, and luminance space. And now the white disks aren't near anything else, and it's quite easy to see how to group them. Even more so if you look at this example where the dominant percept for a human is of two rings that overlap. How do you get that out of pixel space? It's not perhaps that obvious, but if you just, again, add a dimension and do it in XY orientation space, then those two rings, it turns out, don't even touch. So it's kind of obvious you should group them as two different things. And of course, this representation is quite a bit like what we might find in V1 in human vision. And a lot of the early work I did in visual search was also of this flavor, and I won't go into too much detail here, but Angie talked about search for pink, and I also had done some stuff. It's known that at least in this kind of display, search for red among pink is easier than search for pink among red. And it turns out if you pick sort of like the right color space and you represent the colors in the right way, there's a sense in which red is just more distant from the other colors than pink is, and so in that sense, it's not so surprising that it's easier to search for red among pink. Okay, so back to TED per se. During this time, we had become friends. We'd done some traveling together after conferences, and you know, we were essentially just friends, but I think it'd be fair to think of some of this work, at least in my head, as sort of like, you know, it's very TED-inspired work. It's sort of like flirting for nerds, if you will. But at some point, I realized that this wasn't being very effective flirting, and I went on to work on applied vision for things like user interfaces at Xerox PARC. And of course, at that point, Ted decided he was interested in dating. And not too long afterwards, there's us at our wedding, and not too long after that, that's not a fake video, in spite of its similarity to the one that Hani showed. Sarah, by the way, is now 17 and just took the SAT today, and Robin is 15. So you might want to know, for instance, how is Ted as a dad? And of course, there's lots of things that I could tell you. You know, I can tell you that when they were young, for instance, he had a lot of patience for spending a lot of time with them, much more patience than I had, frankly. He could just spend, you know, hours sitting with them, and he's often taking videos of them while he's playing with them. But I have to say, the videos weren't necessarily the videos that a typical dad would take. This is, some of you may have seen this. This is Sarah, although you never see her head. She's essentially in an experiment to see whether or not she can tell wet checks, which is her preference, from dry checks. And we had a lot of conversations about how the people who study development perhaps need to do more stimuli that are food, because there's very subtle image differences between these two kinds of checks, and yet she can definitely tell the difference. Gotta include Robin. Here's Robin. I'm not sure if this was grasping or material perception, but she's exploring that metal object. At any rate, and you might also get the picture from this that there were a lot of unique toys. Oh, but I'll show you that in a second. Now you might think, now those are some pretty strange pictures or videos to take of your kids, but in all fairness, this is what a TED idea of a selfie is. I went through all of our photos to find some good things. Ted and I have a debate about who has the more work photos in our Google photo thing, and Ted has far more, but he thinks it's me. All right, so the girls did have some creative toys. There's Robin playing with yet another kind of object on her jumpy thing. Here's Sarah with a homemade toy. Some of these were perhaps better thought out than others. And by the way, you'll notice that wire that's attached here. That'll come up later in another context. All right. Okay, so we had kids, and then not long after that, I hit it off on a different research trajectory, which kind of ironically turned out to have a lot to do with Ted's discussions about things versus stuff. And Jitendra nicely introduced this earlier on, so some of this will be familiar to you. But basically, the general idea is that we know that at some point in visual cognition, right, that we reason about things. I think this is one of my examples, is, you know, if you're in this car and you're trying to decide whether or not you can get into that lane, you know, you're deciding about your own thing, your car, how fast you're going. You look at those two vehicles and how fast they're going and how much is the space between those two objects. You know, you're reasoning about things. And that's fine, but the danger is that we humans really like to reason about things and think about things. And it's even worse because if we're trying to understand human vision, we often designed the stimulus by putting things in the stimulus, so it's really tempting to keep thinking about things. And But on the other hand, at least early vision is likely much more about stuff. It's filter outputs and nonlinearities and the results of image processing operations. And as a result of that, thing theories often don't do nearly as well at explaining human vision than stuff theories. And so one place where this comes up is with peripheral crowding. And this is the classic sort of demonstration. If you fixate that top plus and try to read the letter off to the left, it's relatively easy to read that isolated letter. You flank it with some other letters, and it becomes more difficult. You move those flanking letters farther apart, and it becomes easy again. And there was a lot of think going on when people thought about crowding. So for instance, people talk about it not only as occurring between objects, but also almost like the objects have like intentions. So they talk about the flankers crowding the target. Crowding is like a transitive verb in a lot of people's minds. And the dissimilar flankers don't interfere with the target as much as similar flankers and stuff like that. You hear people talking about crowding occurring when the centroids of the objects are within a certain spacing, right? Which is, again, very much a thing thought kind of way of thinking of things. There's models in which the visual system identifies the items, each of the items in the display, and then sort of perversely loses their location information so that when you ask about the target, it reports a different item. And somewhat more in the stuff way of thinking, there were starting to be these thoughts that you would extract one feature per item, like orientation, and then crowding occurred because people were could only respond based on the mean of those features. So those are all kind of thing thought, but there was things that are starting to sound, at least to our mind, like stuff thought. People were talking about crowding occurred because of forced texture perception, or Letvin talked about there being the loss of the quality of form, and the peripheral crowded word only seems to have a statistical existence. This sounds a little bit more like stuff to me. And as Jitendra has so nicely introduced, when it comes to stuff and things and something like texture perception, this is not our first rodeo. There's already been a big battle, if you will, in texture perception between thing models of texture perception and stuff models of texture perception. And I think it's quite fair to say that the stuff models won. And so based on this, we developed a model of crowding based on the summary image statistics used by Porti and Simoncelli in their state-of-the-art model of texture perception. And I won't go into too much detail here, but long story short, first of all, this stuff model can explain crowding. Each symbol here and in all the next plots I'm going to show you represents a different condition. You can get an idea of what the conditions look like down here at the bottom. And you can see that just in general, the stuff model does a pretty good job of predicting the human performance at identifying these peripheral symbols. And the cool thing about this model, and which also this is a bit of a trend when you have a stuff model as opposed to a thing model, is that, well, first of all, crowding doesn't just happen with letter arrays, right? It also happens in things like scenes. And it's particularly hard in general to apply thing theories to something like a natural image. But stuff models you don't usually have the same kind of problem. So we can also look at a whole bunch of scene tasks where people fixate in the center of the scene, and we ask them to judge the gist of the scene. And you can see that even for these scene tasks, the peripheral vision model does a pretty darn good job of predicting the performance of the fixating human. And one way of thinking about this is that peripheral vision is a really important limiting factor in scene perception. And as a result, if you understand peripheral vision, you can understand what makes scene perception easy and hard. And not only scenes, you can also, it turns out, predict search difficulty. And again, in case of search, it's tempting to think in terms of things because after all, you're looking for a thing, the target, and it's surrounded by other things, the distractors. And a lot of the theories were these sort of thing theories. And so, for instance, a very classic one from Anne Treisman suggested that you have to pay attention to an item in order to bind its features and recognize it, and you need to do that in order to find the target. And this is what makes some search tasks difficult. But it turns out you can also it predicts search with the same stuff model, this peripheral vision model. So here again, the model prediction predicts the search performance for a whole bunch of different conditions. And the other really nice thing about stuff models is that it's often true that you can fiddle with the image a little bit and get different performance. And the thing models often can't handle this. And in fact, we've done this. We made some of the lines thicker and some of them thinner and some of them longer. And the thing theories to a first approximation don't predict any difference, but you do in fact get a difference in terms of how easy or hard the search is, and it's exactly the direction that the theory predicts, okay? And this, by the way, calls into question all sorts of things that we knew about attention, because a lot of attention theories built off of these, assuming that it was the explanation in these search results, and maybe it's not. And again, the reason why this works to some extent is peripheral vision is an important limiting factor for search. You understand peripheral vision, you can understand a lot about search. And so all of this together, it turns out, is fairly important, because the fact that you can not only explain the easy scene perception in many cases, but with the same model predict the difficult search performance is really something that one couldn't do before. The attention theories, again, being these thing theories, had a hard time being even generalized to scene perception. And certainly if you need attention to an object to bind its features, it's hard to see why you would be so good at scene perception. And so in many cases, people have added another mechanism to explain why scene perception is so easy. We can do this with one stuff mechanism can explain both the easy scene perception and the easy and hard search performance, which is pretty cool. And another way of putting this from sort of a slightly more philosophical point of view is that, you know, there's this puzzle of why is it that we feel like we have a percept of a rich detail. And even more importantly, of course, real world vision works quite well. But when people probe how well we know the details, for instance, with tests like the visual search, it seems like we do badly. And I think that a big piece of understanding this puzzle is understanding this peripheral vision with this stuff theory. So in some sense, I mean, I think first of all, Ted has been quite amused that I've picked up the mantle of the things and stuff perceptions while he was then free to go on to study things like touch. And in addition, I think you can see aspects of the Alpern's razor in here. You know, the boring explanation in many of these cases is that it's just all about peripheral vision. Okay. So I just want to end with, I'm sure you have lots of questions about what it's like to live with Ted, and of course there's lots of things I could say. I just want to talk about one principal component, if you will, and that is, Bernd actually asked me once upon a time, who likes shopping more, you or Ted? Or he might have phrased it as, who likes to spend money more, you or Ted? And I said, who do you think? And he correctly said, anyone want to guess? Ted. Yes, Ted likes shopping more. And in fact, the UPS guy has thanked us for keeping him employed, just to give you an idea. And in fact, the girls once did a project for school where they built, Witu is an Indian, Native American house. They built it out of the Amazon boxes that we hadn't yet recycled that week. And in fact, another example is, you know, the girls, because he buys so much stuff, we have a lot of stuff in the house, and the girls have gone to him to say, hey, for a school project, I need some plexiglass. And Ted's response is, what thickness and how much? And so I want to suggest that we end this by playing a game that the girls often play, and they, by the way, they have approved and helped with these last few slides, which is, why did Dad buy this? So let's start with the first one, a special subset of the why did Dad buy this, and can I eat it? So any guesses? So the choices here are, is this science or snack? Who thinks science? All right, and now who thinks snack? Okay, well this was in fact science, and no, they can't eat it. Does anyone want to take a guess as to why, or maybe some of you know, why did Ted buy this? No, that is a good guess. We certainly have gone through the real and fake food phase also. Ted, perhaps you would like to say, although I could if you would prefer.
Go ahead.
So my understanding is that he buys this for his class because he's having people close their eyes and try and tell the difference between the different components of trail mix and feed themselves, feed other people with their eyes closed and so on. Does that sound fair? So combination of material perception and grasping, I would say. Okay, related. Okay, why did Ted buy this? And can I eat it? This is a big collection of Tic Tacs, I believe. So let's do the same thing. Science or snack? Science? Okay, good. Snack? A few more think it's snack. No, we could not eat this either, I'm sorry to say. This was Ted's orange period. Quite a few of you have shown slides, and I kept worrying that someone was going to explain this and ruin my slide, but no one actually explained it. So we had lots of orange stuff in the house, including other things that we also couldn't eat. I mean, that one you just don't want to eat, but this one is licorice, and no, we couldn't eat that. Does anyone know why we had so much orange stuff in the house? Related to that, yeah. So here's a slide from Ted to show it. It turns out if you have orange stuff and you take a picture of it by looking in 2 different color channels, you can essentially simultaneously take a picture of a black bunch of stuff and a white bunch of stuff, and you can see the exact same stuff, except it's a different reflectance, and see what that looks like. Okay, just a couple more. Here's another one. This says, why did Ted buy this? Because this predates the kids. This is back when we were friends. And we met up at some social event, and Jeff Lubin was also there. And Ted showed up slightly late at this social event, and he excitedly handed me this. And he said, "Ruth, look what I got you." To which Jeff replied, so I knew what I was getting into, let's just say. But okay, some of you, I'm sure, know why did he get this? No, it's not because I like to cook. Any guesses? This was the phase when he was buying lots of spherical or semi-spherical things of different materials, so that, and he and I had been talking about perhaps working together on appearance of these sort of mirrored surfaces. Okay, why did Dad buy this? Any guesses? Some of you guys know, congratulations. Yes, you were not fooled. This is not science, at least as far as I know. And you wouldn't want to eat this. It's because Ted likes birds. There's that wire again. The birds, too, have unique toys. And eventually, after a year of trying to get the squirrels to stay away, we decided we also liked the squirrels. Okay, so I will just end by saying a big thanks, of course, to Ted for many fun years and hopefully many more. Also to the other speakers, I want to say thanks. A huge thanks to the organizers who in particular managed to make all of this happen while I was busy, off planning VSS and didn't have time to help plan this very much. And to you in the audience, thank you all.
Yeah, right. So Ruth is a very hard act to follow, but we're going to ask Ted to do just that.